Hello, LinkedIn. Hello, YouTube. We are live. Today, I am really looking forward to this session, a really important session about how we become more resilient organizations, especially in these difficult times for lots of companies. And I am very pleased to say I am joined today by David Denyer. David is a professor of leadership and organizational change at my old stomping ground, Cranfield School of Management, where I met David. I think we were just talking last time. Did we see each other face to face? No, we saw each other in the gym the other day, but before this was in Seattle, wasn't it?
I think we had dinner in Seattle at the Academy of Management conference many moons ago, and more recently in the gym.
Yes, yeah. Two things I'm very much missing at the moment: traveling to places like Seattle and going to the gym.
Yeah, me too.
How is coronavirus impacting the world of business schools and your own world at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's impacting all businesses. It's huge. The change that we've undergone in the last 6 weeks or so is massive. We immediately, within, I think it was about a 5-day period, went from teaching pretty much everything face-to-face in classrooms to teaching everything online. So in the last few weeks, I've been doing all my usual sessions with students on Zoom, and managing work with clients, projects, research projects, everything online. And I think, like everyone else, trying to work that in a home environment with my identical twins running around the place and everything else. But it's just amazing, isn't it? The amount of change that we've undergone and how people are, working out new ways of working. I think it's
I same here, and doing live broadcasts with my 3 kids in the house. I just wait for them to start fighting.
Probably one will run in the door any second now, but but I think we've kind of we understand that, don't we? And I think it's great that we are still doing things like this, that we can still do that. I did a conference last week, and I thought it was great that the conference organizers didn't cancel the event like so many others and just switched it to online. And I think you can find ways of working despite the kind of context. But
very good, yeah. I am really looking forward to all the questions. Please feel free. We've had lots of good questions come in over the last few days on LinkedIn and YouTube. But I'm super excited to answer live questions as well. So feel free to ask any questions. Just seeing who joined. We've got already about 1,000 people joining us, which is exciting. We've got Arnie from Sweden. We've got Afolabi from Nigeria. Hi, really good to see you. Alok from India. Jason from Colombia. Someone from Armenia and Morocco. So it's really good to see you all here. Let's kick this off, David. Why do we need to talk about resilience in difficult times like this, and why is it even more important, and what can we learn from the current crisis that we're going through about the importance of resilience?
Yeah. So I think resilience is one of the big challenges of our time, of this current time. I think it's one of the biggest leadership challenges. I think it's something that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to in organizations and as leaders in the past. I think this current crisis has really highlighted the need for resilience. But let's not forget some of the other disruptive events that we've had. If you just go back over the first few months of this year, We've had extreme weather events in Australia, like the bushfires. We've had extreme flooding events. If you look at some organizations like Travelex that had a significant ransomware attack, a cybersecurity incident. We had the US drone attack in Iran, which created instability. We had a volcanic eruption near Manila that caused all kinds of disruption. And in the backdrop of all of that, we've got huge climate change issues that are going to increase the number of disruptive events that I think society is going to experience in the future. So I think for all of those reasons, it feels like that we are suffering from more disruptive events. I think this one in particular is unprecedented. It's both unprecedented in terms of the scale of the disruption, but also unprecedented in terms of the response. But it's not the only disruptive event that we've had. And I think we can probably all agree it's not going to be the last disruptive event that we will encounter. So I just think resilience is a huge issue. And this particular issue has put it into, it's really highlighted the need for it. And I think for a number of reasons that's been the case. So like I said, the scale of the event, the harm that it's done, and I think that, we should just reflect on, all of the harm and loss that people have suffered around the world because of this event. And that is really significant. I think that it's also because every event like this is always surprising, but when you look back, you actually start to question things. There's been a lot in the press saying, is this a black swan event? And, it's a 1 in 100 year event. But actually a lot of the warning signs were there. And it's not a 1 in 100 year event. It just was the last time something like this that happened was about 100 years ago.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And sometimes it feels a bit short-sighted that the latest crisis suddenly gets onto people's radar screens in businesses, and they put this into their risk registers. But actually, resilience means much more. It means actually being able to cope with almost anything, right? So,
yeah.
What really is resilience for you? How would you define resilience?
So, okay, there's a kind of more academic answer and a more practical one. In terms of resilience of any kind of system, we normally talk about resilience of system, whether it's an ecological system or it's a financial system or an organization or an individual, that it's about the ability of that particular system to retain its function, its structure, its identity, regardless of the kind of stresses that are placed on it. So it's about its ability to absorb and adapt to change in the environment. And if we take that to an organizational level, it's really about the ability to survive and thrive regardless of the challenge that is placed onto that organization. The resilience has two elements that are really, I think, relatively easy to understand. The resilience that you do before an event. So that's around the anticipation of it, the preparation that you do for the event. And then there's the resilience that you do after the event. So that's the response that you have to it, and then the adaptation and the learning that you do following the event. And so if we think about that across 4 phases, there's anticipation, preparation, then response, and then adaptation and learning. And where we have a lot of problems in all 4 of those phases in organizations.
Yeah, I agree. And we've had a few questions come in here. One from Mohammed in Nigeria. So basically saying, what what separates good leaders from bad leaders in the time of a crisis? How do you actually improve the resilience in your organization? Alexandra from Sao Paulo in Brazil saying, what kind of soft skills do we need to be improved? Do we need to improve in order to get our leaders ready for this post-COVID-19 world? So the question to you, David, is how do we improve resilience? What are some of the levers we can pull?
Yeah. Okay. So I think about organizational resilience as, or a useful way to think about it is to think about it as a kind of philosophy, a way of thinking, and then in terms of a kind of methodology for doing it. And then there's also a set of practical tools that you can pick up and use. But a lot of those also then stretch into other domains and you can pick up from elsewhere. I think the key things are around some of the principles. So, and it kind of touches on some of the soft skills, because I think when I talk about resilience, it's less for me about systems and structures and processes, and it's more for me about culture and leadership and behaviors within the organization. And some of those kind of, what I've seen in a lot of organizations is those that kind of embrace the concept more as a philosophy rather than just a tool are the ones that tend to be more resilient. And so some of the principles for me are that there's what I would call a healthy uneasiness within the organization. So there's kind of awareness about what could go wrong. People in the organization, the senior leaders, are asking questions about what if. Often we look back at kind of past success that leads to confidence that can lead to complacency, and resilient organizations tend to have this kind of healthy uneasiness. A key concept, second one, and I'll go through about 7 of these very quickly. The second principle for me is one of redundancy or slack in the system. All resilient systems seem to have some redundancy in relation to the duplication of components of that system, or the space and time to be able to absorb the problem. So it's kind of often called a kind of buffering capacity. What I've seen in so many organizations is that we've driven for so many years for efficiency gain, that we've kind of cheese-pared back the organization, taken away all of the slack, and sometimes kind of take away the muscle as well as the fat in the organization. And one thing that all resilient systems have is some of this kind of what's called buffer capacity. I think the third element would be, for me, diversity. And diversity in terms of diverse components of the system. So if you've only got one way to do it, then that is a non-resilient response, because it creates a single point of failure. So there's redundancy and diversity, but also for me, diversity in terms of views and attitudes. And, you know, in so many organizations, we kind of drive for a single goal, a single set of values. We try to recruit people that fit a mold, rather than actually embracing the diversity of the workforce. And of course, when you encounter a really complex problem, you need multiple perspectives. The fourth one I would say is about connectivity and networked. More resilient systems seem to be more connected and more networked than they are more centralized and integrated. I would add into my mix of kind of resilience recipe, I would add in some mindfulness. And what I mean by mindfulness is that it for me is about people noticing the cues in their environment, being alert and attentive and acting with care, and not going on autopilot. You know, you get this feeling, you've probably done this, Bernard, when, you know, you get in a car and you drive somewhere and you think, you know, how the hell did I get here today? That's mindlessness. You know, mindfulness is the opposite. You know, you're in the present, you attend to it. The next one would be about systems thinking, and in terms of soft skills, because what we've noticed from this coronavirus crisis is how interdependent everything is. You know, you've got a a disruption that starts in Wuhan and very quickly connects to every sector and every country around the world. And it just shows how interconnected everything is. And if we just see the world through silos and we don't embrace that connectivity and that system view, then I think we've got a problem. And my seventh one, my last one, would be around adaptive capacity and learning in the organization. And this talks to, I think, also a creativity and innovation agenda. And I think what's been really interesting when you look at this coronavirus crisis is how you've gotten a lot of these very bottom-up initiatives that are starting around the world, where people have taken up their authority to, in the leadership sense, to be able to make a difference. And whether that is someone using their 3D printer to help create PPE for hospitals, or it's a local business rethinking what it does. There's some examples of people that are like gin manufacturers that have turned their hand to creating sanitizers and so on. I think within a crisis, what we tend to do is more centralization, more control. And what this shows is actually adaptation and innovation is absolutely critical within a crisis. So in terms of soft skills or a kind of set of principles, that's what I would offer in terms of resilience, in terms of leadership actions, leadership practices, or a kind of culture of resilience.
Yeah, really, really good point. And for me, if an organization wanted to work with me, and we look at their strategy, we try to understand their strategic goals and value drivers. What is then really important is that we then look at data that supports all of this, and then really create this decentralized decision-making model where you then give people access to data, you give them the tools and organizational culture and freedom to make decisions. So this is completely in line with some of the points you've just made.
Yeah.
And then
I'll pick up on that as well, because I really like what you've said there, is that you said a decentralized decision-making model. When I've heard a lot of people talking about this crisis and how leaders need to act, there's often they're often saying or framing this around, we need to communicate more or more effectively. But actually, there's a big difference between communication and actually empowering people in the decision-making or involving them in a decision-making process. I think there's a big difference between the two. And leaders can often think that they're communicating when they're actually just informing rather than actually involving. And I think that for me is significant.
Yeah, which links to your diversity point and actually being able to listen to everyone's views and taking them on board. And for me, the biggest asset any organization can have in this fight against coronavirus and in their endeavor to become more resilient is actually to rely on human creativity and human ingenuity. And for this, what you need to create, you need to create the right organizational culture to foster this and give people the right tools to make this happen.
Yeah, I think there's also there was a question I think came in from Jonathan Harding on LinkedIn, which was, has our sort of focus on an individual leader actually contributed to the lack of resilience in organizations? And I think this is a really interesting topic for a bit of discussion around, because I think there's a real paradox when there's a crisis. When there's a crisis, what people want is the really strong, heroic leader to stand up and say, I've got the direction, follow me, get behind me, I'm going to drive through change. It's someone that they can relate to, that offers an answer to the problem. And I think what that does from a psychological level is it actually alleviates anxiety of people, because this is a really stressful situation. What you want is the strong, heroic leader to stand up. And you look at when in the UK, Boris Johnson was ill in hospital, it creates a vacuum. and people do want that strong leader. But what we're also talking about here is that what we actually need is leadership. And I make this big distinction between a kind of leader view and a leadership view. And the leadership view is that we need people at multiple different levels in organizations to take up their authority, to make a difference, and to innovate and be creative and do those things. And we are seeing a lot of that around the world that's making a huge difference. But of course, these two things are paradoxical, because on the one hand, as a leader, you've got to be the strong leader that everyone wants, but create the environment for leadership to flourish through the organization. And I think for anyone that's leading through a crisis is keeping those different views in mind and saying, how do I be this strong leader and create the environment? And I think things like, if you want to create innovation and distributed decision making, then you've really got to focus on things like creating psychological safety within the organization, because when people are anxious, they don't innovate, they don't want to take the risks that we actually need them to take. They're more likely to be compliant than they are to be creative. And I think a lot of that action needs to be authorized by leaders. So, you know, we might expect people to be really adaptive and really creative and to take their initiative, but they're probably too scared to in a lot of organizations. So it actually requires some authorization to enable it to happen. So this interplay between strong leader and leadership, I think, is crucial.
Yeah, I agree. And which also links to some of the other diversity and redundancy points that you've made, because I always think organizations focus sometimes too much on making their processes as streamlined and as effective and efficient as they can. And actually by doing this, they can sometimes stifle innovation. So if everything is too optimized, it then leaves no room, and it doesn't leave you any redundancy to get things done, but it also doesn't leave you the room to be more innovative, I think.
Yeah. And this is something that I've done a lot of work on, is offering a view on organizational resilience that looks at the management of these tensions. And I think it's the real task of leadership to manage some of these tensions. So if you talk about that one, that's about, do I as a leader think that I'm going to be successful because I optimize what I've always done? So we're in the same sector, the same markets, with the same technology, and we just optimize it and we improve it, or do we actually need to do something different? I mean, we've already talked on some of the other issues, like people being creative when they're also being asked to be compliant. Where's the line in the sand between I follow the rule and I'm now actually authorized to break the rule because we've now got a problem that we've never seen before? And people don't like crossing that line. It's a bit like, you know, a trapeze artist, someone on a trapeze, you go across and you've got to ask them to let go. Unless you create that safety net underneath them, they're never going to let go, go to the other side. And so I think there's a lot of these tensions, you know, tension between, in particular, a lot of people listening might be in highly regulated industries. How do you marry that need for regulation and assurance and accountability with this need for more decentralized innovation happening in organizations? So I think the management of these tensions is crucial.
Very good. And then we had a question coming in from Michael Moltsev as well. What does this mean for just-in-time concepts? Will they be modified in the future? And for me, this is any optimized processes, you need a little bit of slack in them. You need a bit of redundancy and some freedom to innovate. And for me, looking at your entire supply chain in a crisis like this is really important. I think in this country, we've done this in the UK because of Brexit. I think lots of companies and organizations have looked at their supply chain. But what do you see there, David?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Just in time, again, for me, fits into that mold of kind of an optimization agenda. And you know, reduction of inventory, and we've seen the problems that we've had with kind of supply chains over the last few weeks. Yeah, I agree. I think it's about rethinking the need for building some redundancy and slack into systems and not operating them at absolute capacity, because as soon as you stretch the system in any way, then those kind of systems can fall down. So yeah, good question.
Yeah, and the other question that's come in is the role of technology in improving resilience, and this is something I've argued for in many posts and many conversations recently, that I believe that automation, more robots, artificial intelligence, things like chatbots will make organizations more resilient, because it's especially in a crisis like this, where suddenly people are furloughed and locked away. The more we can automate some of these business processes, the more resilient organizations will become. On another interesting technology I think has real potential over the next few months is augmented reality. Just using new tools. So I've recently had a really cool demonstration of an augmented reality tool, where you basically, lots of service companies can't visit. So if your broadband goes down, if something is broken, if your dishwasher is broken, they might not want to come to your house. Actually, what they can do now is they can do this over the phone, and they can actually point you, they can direct you using augmented reality to look at the problem, to self-diagnose some of these, and you have an expert sitting with you. So lots of these technologies will make a real difference.
I'd love that right now, because my dishwasher's not working.
Is it not? yeah, that's not great.
I think that if you also look at technology and back to what I said earlier about anticipation, preparation, and then response, and then adaptation and learning, technology can play a part in all four of those phases. So I think in terms of the anticipation phase, that we are, potentially facing a lot of disruptive events. There's always some weak signals for that. We talked a little bit earlier about this being a black swan event, and I was kind of dismissive of that, because I think the warning signs were there. I think a lot of technology can pick up and help us pick up on some of those warning signs. I think technology can help us at the other end, because we have, in a lot of industries, we have a lot of disruptive events. And actually, if we can use technology to see the wood from the trees and to draw intelligence from all of that data, we might be in a better place to be able to learn the real lessons from the events that we have and feed that back in to help us prepare better in the future.
Yeah, and for me, data is actually one of the vital ingredients in monitoring your own resilience and assessing future scenarios for your organization. So for me, if you have really good data, if you monitor this data, if you use this data to do forecasts and to make predictions and create different scenarios, this is what you want. And the more you can give people access to this data. I've just today published an article on Forbes on the importance of giving frontline employees access to data, which was based on a study by Harvard Business Review, and they basically said organizations that will be successful in the future are those that have data and give people the tools and the culture to make use of those data points.
So while we're on the technology, and we've got this new app that's being launched in the UK on the Isle of Wight. This is kind of the coronavirus monitoring app. There's been some discussion within the press about the value, which is the intelligence we draw from that, versus the issues around privacy. And have you got any views around that issue?
Is interesting. So basically the discussion at the moment is that Apple and Google created their own process, which is completely decentralized, where phones basically completely anonymously communicate with each other and then give you an alert that you might have been in contact with someone. And this data is not shared with governments, it's not centralized anywhere. The UK, on the other hand, opted for a centralized model where all of this data is sent to a centralized government server. And this has obviously the massive disadvantage is that it has privacy implications. So that the concerns are that the government could potentially use this information, could analyze it, and so on. So the key is, do we trust the UK government to comply with data regulations and so on? I would say yes, I do. I think the problem is the reason this won't be adopted across the world is because there are many places around the world where people really don't trust their government and their leaders to keep this safe for a start and to not misuse this data.
Yeah.
So
it's another interesting dilemma, isn't it?
It is, and actually there are some advantages of having centralized data because you get, as a government, you get much better insight into where outbreaks are happening. You can customize the messages much more to individuals. So there are real advantages of having a centralized model. So we will see. Hopefully people will adopt it, and then what the government is saying here is that they are completely complying with GDPR rules that mean if you want your data deleted at any point, you can just simply have this deleted. So it will be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Any good examples of really resilient organizations or resilient leaders that you have, David? It's always good to make this practical, make this real for people.
Yeah, yes, and So I would say that the banks and the financial institutions in the UK have put a lot of effort into resilience. There was a call by the Bank of England and the two regulators, so the Prudential Regulation Authority and the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, that asked all of the banks to improve their operational resilience. Previously, they've been looking just at financial resilience rather than operational resilience, which is how they respond to disruptive events and how the system could be disrupted. And I think what that's drawn out is that it's made those organizations focus much more on their own resilience. But I think what's been really interesting is that they've also been asked to look at what's their role in contributing to the resilience of the whole system.
Yeah.
Rather than just thinking about themselves, it's about how do we contribute to the role of the system. I draw out a couple of other examples that are more recent. So I've done some work with the Civil Aviation Authority over the last few years. And I think really interesting, they're obviously a regulator, but I think the thought process can be transferred elsewhere, which was asking the question, how do we create assurance that we're managing all of these risks? And what they've done is looked at a comprehensive risk picture, saying we actually need a holistic view of the whole sector to look across those connections that I was talking about earlier, look at all of the risks and also how those risks might interplay with one another. It's a bit of a scary thought at the moment that we've actually got a coronavirus pandemic, but actually this could be happening at the same time as some other really disruptive events. So what if you get this and you throw on top of it a tsunami or the floods or the droughts or some kind of conflict within the world? Then you actually say, well, this is a very plausible scenario. You can get the interplay. So how do we get a holistic picture of the whole sector, and then we can apportion our resource against the areas of most need? I've also been impressed even with some other organizations that I've worked with recently. So there was an insurance company that at the time of the lockdown had already, before the government had said that we're going to have the lockdown, had already managed to get all of its staff working at home and online. They'd also launched a couple of new products that they said that they probably didn't have the risk appetite to do, but as soon as this crisis came around, actually launched because they knew that they had to innovate to get out of this issue. And I thought the other really practical thing that they did was that we've got a lot of these furlough schemes that are going on, the government support for industry. They kind of reframed that and said this is actually a great opportunity for our staff to do some personal development. So rather than just it's, you know, a furlough and people aren't working, they're actually encouraging them to go through a package of training, development, personal development was really powerful. I think, you know, not only sends a good message, but actually develops your people for when they come back to work, when the business picks up again, actually develop themselves. And I think that is so interesting, you know, because so many other organizations, I think, just furloughed their staff and didn't really think of that opportunity. And the other one that I would say is that I'm just starting to do some work with ITV Studios. And I think another one where that is a really good message, because what they've said to me is that the time for learning is now. And actually, if we're going to capture our processes for managing a crisis, it is actually a great time to try and capture that at the moment. So we're working with them to map out some of their processes and how they are dealing with the crisis in the midst of the crisis. What I think most organizations will do is, you know, wait a year until things have calmed down, and then we'll be looking back at this event and trying to say, what could we have done differently? Actually, the real time for learning is now.
I couldn't agree more. We've got so many questions coming in here. We've just do a few shout outs. Leticia from Montreal in Canada. Hello. Akin from Turkey, Sana from Finland, Omar from the Netherlands. Hi, really good to see you all here. We've got Isaac from Peru, Bilin from Barcelona. Some really good questions coming in. One of them asking, what is is security more important than resilience? Which is an interesting question. What's your view on that, David?
So I think they're interrelated. I think the security of any organization, whether it's in a cybersecurity sense or the security of any nation in a more defense and security sense, is intimately tied into resilience. It's exactly the same principles apply. That a breach of security still has those same 4 steps in terms of you can anticipate it, you can prepare for it, you can respond to it, you can adapt and learn from it. You know, so for me, they are interconnected and have a lot of the same processes in terms of the kind of methodology that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I completely agree. So what are some of the practical steps that you think organizations can take and that leaders can take to improve their resilience right now in order to emerge from this crisis in a stronger position?
Okay, so I would say that there are, I'll give you a few thoughts. And the first one is a really scary thought. That for me, if we go back to that notion of one of the principles being a kind of healthy uneasiness and this wariness, then if we should really be taking this mindset as that this is a bit of a dry run for future events. I mean, it's a scary thought, but like I said, this particular event has had a massive impact in terms of the loss and the harm, and also the response. But equally, it's not going to be the last one that we have. So actually learning the lessons from this, I think that we should, you mentioned earlier, the problem of risk registers, you know, which we actually play a lot of lip service to. You know, we have a matrix, probability and consequence, and we have all the risk. Incidentally, pandemic risk on the UK risk register and most of the risk registers around the world is highly probable and highly consequential, but we didn't do anything about it. So my second step is, you know, how many boards pull out the risk register every year? They do a bit of an update and go, yeah, that's okay, we put it back on the shelf. It's kind of shelfware, rather than actually we manage the risks of the organization. You mentioned another one that I'll pick up on, I think that we do a lot of training and learning in organizations that's more compliance-based training rather than actually creating a set of realistic scenarios. And if we want our people to be able to react and adapt and learn and have the right behaviors and the right culture around disruptive events, then we need to give them some of those realistic events on which they can practice. So I think that going forward, using those, I've mentioned capturing, embedding the learning from these events, I think is crucial. I've also mentioned that, that we've still got several weeks more of the furlough scheme. And actually, if we can practically turn that into a learning development, personal development opportunity, you mentioned already, so many organizations are going to have to embrace a digital future. Can we actually use this time to both encourage people and develop their skills in working in a more digital way? I think that would be a really practical use of their time. And then I think in terms of leadership practices, I've mentioned some of these things. I think there is a need to build psychological safety in the organization. I think there is a need to supplement communication with the shared decision making that we talked about earlier. And I think if leaders, we often see the really good leaders in the organizations that do this naturally. If you've got leaders in your organization that are struggling with that, then get them some coaching, get them some support, get them some development so they can help their teams. And I think the last one I would say is that it is a really good opportunity, I think, at the moment to initiate the innovation that we talked about earlier. And what I would tend to do or want to do is to create a kind of design thinking initiative within the organization, take a small team and really give them the license and the support to really rethink the business, to really think about how do we drive some change. Okay, you're going to have most of your team that are going to be doing business as usual and trying to keep the ship afloat. But my concern is that if we all retrench and we get more preventative, more controlling, and we just stick to what we've always done, it's a bit like, the old Western films when the Indians are around and then we put the wagons in a circle and, we've stopped moving forward. At some point in time, we've got to say to a small team, you've got to break out of this and find a new way. And I think it's a great opportunity at the moment to actually be more forward thinking, to task a small group within the organization, create a design thinking team, and let them innovate.
100% agree. Just have some comments from YouTube as well. I'm seeing people from Khalil from Dubai. Hi, really good to see you. I've got Josephat from Nairobi in Kenya. One question that's come in here on LinkedIn is from Dr. Mohammed Tash from Egypt. Do resilient organizations have indicators upon which we can measure or determine their resilience levels? And so how do we measure resilience? For me, this is linked to another question that Rodrigo Faustino from Portugal is asking, saying in these unprecedented times of real instability for businesses, how can we use coronavirus data to improve our business decisions? And for me, this goes back to a point that I was trying to make earlier, that for me, organizations obviously have risk registers, they have performance management systems. What I see very often is that these don't talk to each other. They're two completely separate documents. And for me, when I help organizations develop performance management systems, what we do is we design key KPIs, key performance indicators, but then key RIs, key risk indicators, for me, are the flip sides, where you then look at each of your key performance drivers. So if you think about your market, your economy, your customer engagement, your employer brand, it's all nice to measure those, but what are some of the scenarios, some of the data points around this? How is this going to be affected in the future? What are the trends? And for this coronavirus data, for me, there are some important proxies that seem to be emerging at the moment. One is the R value, this reproductive value. So basically meaning how many, once you have the virus, how many other people do you infect? And if the R value is 1, meaning if you have the virus, you infect one other person, then we are staying stable. If this goes beyond 1, that means the virus is going down in the country. And from what it looks like is, at the moment in the UK, for example, I think we are at 1.7, I believe. This is going down rapidly, which is good. And then things like test positivity rates for me are also really important. So I think South Korea discovered their first case at the same time as the US did, but they then tested rapidly. They tested lots of people, and they tested about 1% of their population and discovered around 10,000 cases, or just over 10,000 cases. And the US has tested over 3.5 million people, which is also about 1%. And they found over 600,000 cases. So this for me is again an indication of how widespread the virus is in your country, which I think if you compare the US, it's about 20% positivity rate compared to 2% in South Korea. So again, if you are operating in a specific country, even better if you look at this at regional levels. If you're operating in the north of the country, the south of the country, look at some of these numbers regionally in order to detect what the risks are there. And for me, this all comes down to good performance management and the good use of data. Anything to add, David?
I think the one thing I would add is to try and shift from just having the lagging indicators, which are measuring things after the event, to having some leading indicators, which might suggest that you're on the right track to being more resilient. And if you go back to some of those underpinning principles of resilience that I outlined right at the start of this this conversation, that you can find some measures in each one of those. So a measure of how you've got this culture of healthy uneasiness, or a measure of redundancy, or a measure of diversity, or a measure of kind of network connectivity, or mindfulness, or systems thinking, or this adaptive capacity. You could break those down into a set of measures. If you then had those 7 as kind of leading indicators, they might give you some idea that you're on the right track. I think the one thing with resilience is that it's a little bit like health. It kind of reveals itself when you haven't got it, when you're unhealthy and you're ill. And it's easier to measure ill than it is to measure being healthy. But maybe some of those 7 principles broken down into a set of measures might give you some way of measuring it.
Very good. We've got so many more questions. So what I will do after this session is I will go into LinkedIn and have a look at some of the questions, and we'll try to answer them. Are you happy to do the same, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we'll try and answer them. And I'm sure we both got some material as well. We can point people to some additional information sources.
Exactly.
That might help with some of them.
Exactly. So I've got one. Let's make this the final question. Joe Mardell from the UK. Interesting question, saying, do you think there will be a post-pandemic startup boom similar to the 2008 recession, in which we saw the emergence of startups like Square, Airbnb, and Slack? What I think, my belief is that this will happen, because there are so many startups that are already in the pipeline. And for me, this was similar to what was happening in 2008, when the platform economy was just starting to grow, and organizations found themselves in a world where people now had strong internet access. They were used to social media, and they were happy to embrace platforms like Airbnb and others. So platform businesses, I think, were 2008, the big boom. What I believe the boom will be after coronavirus is around artificial intelligence and machine learning. We've seen this before the pandemic already, and this, I believe, will continue. And the other trend that I think is really important to watch is augmented reality. I think this is where we will, especially if you look at what is happening with some of the latest handsets from Apple and mobile phones from Samsung, artificial intelligence combined with augmented reality are the biggest trends that will innovate and give us completely new business models and new startups. So those are the two areas that I'm seeing. What's your view, David?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, and also I think your comment about augmented reality and artificial intelligence, if you link back to what I was saying about learning from this crisis, I think could be really used to help us learn some of the lessons and some of that future scenario, making very realistic scenarios for people to kind of stress test their systems. I think would be a really good benefit from this. I think that we potentially will have a boom. I think it will vary, though. I think different sectors are going to have a very different response. We've already seen some really heavily hit by this, and I think the recovery will be quite long and painful. And I think we will have a boom in certain areas that will really kick back very quickly. And I think that just goes back to what we were saying earlier around the need to innovate and to find new ways of working. I think people are rethinking their businesses. I think they are innovating, and I think those that innovate have probably got the exit strategy, and the ones that don't innovate might be on that longer and slower and more difficult recovery period. So I just see there's going to be huge variability.
Very good. Yeah, I agree. I just saw one more final comment by Fazil. Will blockchain have? What is the question? Will blockchain help dealing with all of this? Yes, I believe it will. For me, this is a trend that isn't quite on the same level as artificial intelligence and augmented reality, but it's definitely bubbling below. I believe distributed ledger technology will make a big impact, but I think we might be a few years off the companies that will make a real impact in the world. Very good, David. Thank you so much. That was really fun. Hopefully we can do this again.
Indeed. Maybe not dinner in Seattle, but maybe it would be a dinner somewhere.
That would be good. That would be good.
Virtual dinner.
Yeah. Yeah. Next time we do this with a glass of wine.
Good.
Very good. We now have a bit of homework to do. We will go through some of the questions, and hopefully over the next few days we'll answer them. Thank you so much for everyone taking part. Thank you everyone on YouTube.
Great questions.
And we will see you shortly. I have another LinkedIn Live coming up with the head of artificial intelligence from Microsoft on Thursday. If you go to my channel, you can find out more about this. In the meantime, stay safe. Thank you very much, David.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.